Ever wonder why your grandparents get that weird look when you mention certain cartoons from their childhood? The 1960s weren't just the era of peace and love. They were the Wild West of animation, where censors slept at the wheel and cartoonists seemed to operate on a different planet. Ready to dive into the weirdest, most jaw-dropping cartoon moments that had parents writing angry letters? These aren't your average Saturday morning memories. These are the episodes that changed children's TV forever. The Flintstones. The Flintstones wasn't just about Stone Age hijinks. It was the first primetime animated show to depict pregnancy on American television. When Wilma announced she was expecting, parents across America nearly choked on their TV dinners. The 1963 episode, The Blessed Event, showed Fred panicking about becoming a father, complete with nervous breakdowns and midnight hospital rushes. Network executives initially fought against the pregnancy storyline, fearing it would be too adult for viewers. One ABC executive reportedly asked, "How do we know they didn't just find the baby under a rock? This is the Stone Age." But creators Hanna-Barbera stood firm, arguing that family life included babies. The episode drew massive ratings, but also angry letters from parents who weren't ready to explain where babies came from to their cartoon-watching kids. The controversy didn't stop there. Wilma's maternity clothes and the eventual birth of Pebbles pushed boundaries nobody thought cartoons would touch. Today, it's considered a landmark moment when animation grew up, proving cartoons could tackle real-life situations beyond falling anvils and talking animals. Space Ghost. Space Ghost wasn't just fighting random space villains. He was battling literal nightmare fuel. The 6-part episode, The Council of Doom, featured a sequence where Space Ghost gets trapped in a dimension of living darkness that absorbed light, hope, and eventually your soul. Kids who tuned in expecting typical superhero action instead got existential horror as Space Ghost faced his own mortality. The episodes were so intense that CBS received over 2,000 complaint calls from parents whose children refused to sleep with the lights off after watching. One mother from Ohio wrote, "My son now believes darkness is alive and coming to get him. Thanks for the therapy bills." What made these episodes particularly shocking was the animation style. Unlike the bright, clean lines of most 60s cartoons, these sequences used experimental shadow techniques and disorienting perspective shifts. The villains didn't just threaten to destroy Space Ghost, they threatened to erase him from existence entirely. Network executives reportedly demanded rewrites to include more comic relief, but creator Alex Toth refused, saying, "Kids understand darkness better than adults think." The episodes aired unedited and became legendary for pushing animation into psychological territory nobody thought possible in a children's show. Johnny Quest. Johnny Quest crossed a line nobody knew existed when The Invisible Monster episode featured a creature that dissolved humans on screen. This wasn't your typical cartoon villain. This was a nightmare made of energy that literally absorbed people, showing their silhouettes as they disappeared into nothingness. The episode aired in prime time when kids were definitely watching. Parents were horrified by the realistic screams and the explicit nature of the deaths. The animation showed victims' outlines struggling inside the monster before fading away entirely. Network censors initially rejected the episode, with one CBS executive reportedly saying, "This isn't a cartoon, it's a horror film." Creator Doug Wildey defended the content, arguing that children needed more sophisticated storytelling. "Kids aren't stupid," he reportedly told executives. "They know the difference between fantasy and reality." The episode eventually aired but was later heavily edited for reruns. Animation historians point to this episode as the moment when Saturday morning cartoons began to include genuine horror elements. The monster's design was so disturbing that similar creatures were banned from cartoons until the 1980s, when standards relaxed again. Even today, animation scholars study The Invisible Monster as an example of how far children's programming pushed boundaries during the experimental 1960s. The Herculoids. The Herculoids took alien invasions to disturbing new places with The Beaked People, an episode featuring bird-human hybrids conducting experiments on humans. The beaked aliens captured villagers and subjected them to transformation rays that began turning them into mindless bird creatures. The partially transformed humans, caught between species, begged for help with haunting, gargled speech. parents were stunned by the body horror elements rarely seen outside of sci-fi films. The animation explicitly showed human features morphing into beaks and feathers, with the victims clutching their changing limbs in agony. One PTA group in California organized a letter-writing campaign, calling the episode a disturbing perversion of evolution that gives children nightmares. What made the episode especially controversial was its Cold War subtext. The Beaked People's mind control and experimentation mirrored fears of brainwashing and communist infiltration. Network executives allowed the episode to air despite concerns, believing the political allegory would go over children's heads. They were wrong. Playground discussions about becoming someone else became so common that several schools sent notes home to parents about increased anxiety among students. The episode was pulled from rotation after just 3 airings, but became infamous among animation fans who traded bootleg copies for decades before the internet made it widely available. The Jetsons. The Jetsons went from family-friendly future fun to workplace nightmare fuel with Uniblab, an episode that tackled corporate espionage, unemployment anxiety, and technological replacement. The robot Uniblab was introduced as George's new co-worker, but quickly became a spy for the boss, recording private conversations and getting employees fired. What shocked parents wasn't just the adult workplace themes, but the genuine desperation as George feared losing his job. The episode showed him sweating, panicking about mortgage payments, and worrying about feeding his family. Heavy content for a cartoon supposedly about flying cars and robot maids. When George finally defeated Uniblab by getting him drunk on nuts and bolts, the robot began hiccuping, smoking, and essentially died on screen. Labor unions praised the episode for its commentary on automation anxiety, while business groups condemned it as anti-progress propaganda. One executive from General Electric called it irresponsible fear-mongering about beneficial technology. Hanna-Barbera received so many complaints from corporate sponsors that they never again addressed workplace automation in the series. The episode remains a fascinating time capsule of 1960s fears about computers replacing human workers. Fears that seem remarkably prescient today as AI enters the workplace. Shazam. Shazam took a dark turn with The Living Island, an episode featuring a landmass that was actually alive and consumed people whole. Children who tuned in for magical adventures instead witnessed an island that could feel pain, scream in agony, and worse. Hungrily absorb humans into its soil, where their faces would briefly appear on the surface before sinking away forever. Parents were disturbed by the haunting imagery of victims' faces emerging from the ground, their expressions frozen in terror as they called for help. The episode received immediate backlash, with child psychologists warning about potential trauma. Dr. Margaret Wilson, a prominent child development expert at the time, called it a visualization of quicksand nightmares that many children already fear. What made this episode particularly controversial was the animation technique used for the absorption scenes. The faces were more realistically drawn than the cartoonish main characters, creating an uncanny valley effect that heightened the horror. The episode was quickly pulled from rotation and edited for future airings, removing the close-ups of victims' faces. Animation historians now view The Living Island as an example of 1960s cartoons experimenting with horror concepts without fully considering their impact on young viewers. The original uncut version circulated among collectors for years as a legendary banned episode, The Banana Splits Adventure Hour. The Banana Splits weren't just playing music, they were accidentally teaching kids about cults. The live-action animation hybrid took a bizarre turn with the Sour Grapes Bunch episode, where a rival group brainwashed fans through hypnotic musical frequencies that made children mindlessly obedient. Parents were disturbed by scenes showing blank-eyed children following commands without question, especially during an era when real-life cult activities were making headlines. The episode featured the zombie-like kids vandalizing property and turning against their parents when instructed. One father from Michigan wrote to NBC, "My daughter spent hours staring at our record player after watching, believing it would tell her what to do." Network executives defended the episode as harmless fantasy, but child psychologists disagreed. Dr. Thomas Radecki, who later became chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence, cited this episode in early research about suggestible behaviors in children. The episode was quietly removed from rerun packages after several parent-teacher associations organized viewing boycotts. Today, animation historians view The Sour Grapes Bunch as an accidental reflection of 1960s anxieties about youth counterculture and mind control packaged in what was supposed to be innocent children's entertainment. Marine Boy dove into controversial waters with The Neptune Fleet, an episode featuring radiation-mutated sea creatures attacking humans. This wasn't just another monster of the week story. The episode explicitly mentioned nuclear testing, showed deformed animals with extra limbs, and depicted scientists expressing guilt for environmental destruction. Parents were shocked by the graphic mutations and the political message about nuclear weapons during the height of Cold War tensions. The episode showed bleeding fish with tumors and explicitly connected their condition to human activities. One memorable scene featured a scientist breaking down in tears, saying, "We did this to them, and now they're doing it to us." The episode caused diplomatic tension when it aired in international markets. The Japanese original was even more explicit about nuclear criticism, but American distributors attempted to soften the message. However, even the edited version was strong enough that several U.S. military officials complained to the network about anti-defense propaganda in children's programming. The episode was pulled from American reruns, but remained intact in European and Asian broadcasts. Animation historians now recognize the Neptune Fleet as one of the earliest environmental protest messages embedded in children's entertainment, arriving years before eco-consciousness became mainstream. SpiderMan swung into controversy with The One-Eyed Mystic, an episode featuring mind-altering substances and hallucinations. When a mysterious villain used incense that caused vivid hallucinations, Spider-Man himself began seeing nightmarish visions, including his own skeleton trying to escape his body and buildings melting into blood-like puddles. Parents were outraged by the psychedelic imagery that seemed to reference drug experiences during an era when authorities were warning about LSD use among teenagers. The animation style changed dramatically during hallucination sequences, using swirling patterns, distorted proportions, and pulsating colors that resembled actual psychedelic art from the counterculture movement. The episode generated over 1,500 complaint letters to ABC, with many accusing the show of glorifying drug culture. Defenders argued it showed the negative effects of mind-altering substances, pointing out that Spider-Man was terrified by his hallucinations. Network executives ordered extensive edits for future airings, removing the most explicit psychedelic imagery. Animation director Ralph Bakshi later admitted, "We were pushing boundaries. Maybe we pushed too far." The controversy contributed to stricter content guidelines for Saturday morning cartoons that remained in place well into the 1970s. The Fantastic Four crossed scientific lines with The Micro-World of Dr. Doom, featuring human experimentation and body horror rarely seen in children's programming. When Dr. Doom shrinks the team to microscopic size, they witness cells being violently destroyed and genetic material being rewritten in grotesque detail. Parents were disturbed by the realistic depictions of biological processes gone wrong, especially a sequence where Reed Richards' elastic body begins to destabilize at the cellular level, showing his molecular structure painfully coming apart. Medical professionals criticized the episode for its graphic biological imagery. Dr. Harold Shipman of Johns Hopkins wrote to the network, "You've essentially shown children what cancer looks like inside the body, causing unnecessary fears about illness." What made the episode particularly controversial was its educational approach to horrific content. The animation carefully explained scientific concepts while showing disturbing visuals. Schools that had planned to use Fantastic Four episodes as science teaching aids immediately canceled those plans. Marvel creator Stan Lee defended the episode, saying, "Kids are fascinated by the human body. We're just showing them what happens inside." Network censors ultimately demanded 7 cuts to the episode before allowing reruns, removing the most explicit cellular destruction scenes. Today, the uncut version is considered a collector's item among animation enthusiasts. Birdman explored identity theft decades before it became a common fear with The Deadly Duplicator, an episode where the villain could create perfect copies of people, including their memories and personalities. The duplicate Birdman believed he was the real hero, leading to an existential crisis as both versions questioned their own reality. Parents were troubled by the philosophical questions the episode raised about identity and consciousness. Children began asking unsettling questions about how they could prove they were real and not replacements. One teacher in Pennsylvania reported students refusing to come to school because they feared their parents had been duplicated overnight. The episode went further than expected when the duplicate Birdman discovered his artificial nature and had an on-screen breakdown screaming, "I'm nothing," before beginning to physically fall apart. This scene of existential horror and body disintegration was unprecedented in Saturday morning cartoons. Network executives initially rejected the episode, with one CBS censor writing, "This is Kafka, not kiddie content." Creator Alex Toth insisted the episode addressed important questions about authenticity in an increasingly artificial world. The episode aired but was heavily edited for reruns, removing the duplicate's breakdown scene entirely. Animation historians now cite The Deadly Duplicator as an early example of philosophical science fiction concepts appearing in children's media. Adam Ant. Adam Ant went from superhero antics to nuclear panic with Up and Atom, an episode where radiation exposure temporarily gave everyone in the city insect characteristics. This wasn't played just for laughs. The episode showed citizens growing extra limbs, developing compound eyes, and losing their humanity as they scuttled around on the ceiling in panic. Parents were horrified by the body horror elements and the casual treatment of radiation, especially during an era of duck-and-cover drills and nuclear anxiety. The transformation sequences were unusually detailed, showing painful mutations as human teeth elongated into mandibles and skin hardened into exoskeletons. The PTA of Greater Boston organized a viewing boycott, calling the episode traumatizing and scientifically irresponsible. What made the episode especially controversial was its mixed message about nuclear power. While the transformations were presented as frightening, Adam Ant himself gained his powers from radiation and represented it as potentially beneficial. Government atomic agencies complained about inaccurate radiation depictions, while anti-nuclear groups complained about trivializing radiation dangers. Hanna-Barbera received so many complaints that they issued a rare public statement defending the episode as imaginative fantasy, not scientific documentary. The episode was significantly edited for reruns, removing the most graphic transformation sequences and adding a disclaimer about the fictional nature of the events. The Superman-Aquaman Hour. The Superman-Aquaman Hour froze parents in their tracks with The Abominable Iceman, featuring a villain who literally shattered frozen victims. This wasn't implied destruction. The episode showed people frozen solid, their terrified expressions visible in the ice before they were smashed into pieces. Parents were stunned by the explicit violence and the victims' clear awareness of their fate before being shattered. The animation emphasized the horror by showing close-ups of frozen faces with moving eyes, indicating the victims were conscious but unable to move as they were about to be destroyed. The National Parents Television Council issued a formal complaint, writing, "Breaking humans, even frozen ones, crosses a line for Saturday morning entertainment." The episode created additional controversy for its scientific explanation of the freezing process, which described in detail how cells rupture when frozen and how a human body would experience the sensation. Several science teachers complained that the show was giving children nightmares about winter weather. Network executives ordered extensive edits for future airings, removing all scenes of shattering victims and close-ups of frozen faces. The episode's director later admitted, "We were trying to make genuine stakes for the hero. Maybe we made them too genuine." The controversy contributed to the formation of more specific violence guidelines for animated programs that remained in effect throughout the 1970s. The Mighty Heroes. The Mighty Heroes melted conventional standards with The Plastic Blaster, an episode featuring a villain who could liquefy human bodies into puddles of conscious goo. This wasn't just any villain. The Plastic Blaster took sadistic pleasure in his work, laughing as people melted while trying to scream for help. Parents were horrified by the liquefaction sequences, which showed detailed stage-by-stage melting from solid to liquid. The episode went further by showing the puddles of former humans still had eyes and mouths, begging to be restored to normal. One particularly disturbing scene showed a melted police officer trying to hold his badge up from his puddle form. The American Academy of Pediatrics issued a statement calling the episode graphic body horror, inappropriate for developing minds. The controversy intensified when creator Ralph Bakshi defended the episode as necessary exaggeration to make villains truly threatening. "Kids know it's not real," he reportedly told network executives. "They just want good guys and bad guys." The episode was immediately pulled from rotation after just 2 airings and extensively reworked for later syndication, removing all scenes showing melting in progress or conscious puddles. Animation historians now recognize the plastic blaster as an early example of Bakshi's boundary-pushing style that would later define adult animation in the 1970s and beyond. Frankenstein Jr. Sparked unprecedented outrage with The Shocking Electric Monster, featuring a villain who could remotely control people's nervous systems, essentially turning them into painful human puppets. The animation explicitly showed victims' bodies contorting against their will, their faces locked in expressions of agony as they were forced to attack friends and family. Parents were disturbed by the body control concept and its implications of violated autonomy. The episode showed particularly unsettling scenes of children being controlled, their limbs moving unnaturally as they cried for help. One mother from Pennsylvania wrote to the network, "My son couldn't sleep for 3 nights, afraid his body would start moving on its own." What made the episode particularly controversial was its realistic approach to the nervous system. Rather than typical cartoon electrocution with X-ray skeletons, the animation showed anatomically accurate neural pathways lighting up as the villain controlled specific body parts. Medical professionals criticized the show for potentially triggering viewers with neurological conditions. The American Neurological Association formally requested the episode be withdrawn, calling it disturbingly accurate in its depiction of neural hijacking. The episode was quickly pulled from rotation after its initial airing and heavily edited before returning to broadcast. Scenes showing children being controlled were completely removed, and the villain's abilities were reframed as simple freezing rather than full body control. Today, animation historians study The Shocking Electric Monster as an example of how 1960s cartoons often introduced concepts too disturbing for their intended audience while attempting to push creative boundaries. So there you have it, 15 episodes that pushed animation to places nobody thought cartoons would go. Did you catch any of these mind-bending episodes when they first aired, or maybe in late-night reruns? Which one sounds the most disturbing to you? Drop a comment below with your memories or reactions. And here's a question. Were these bizarre episodes actually harmful to kids, or were they the reason Gen X grew up with such wild imaginations and thick skin? Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into animation's strangest moments from decades past.